Penniless, jobless, and thrown onto the rainy streets of Chicago, Carly Martin had nothing left but $22 and a desperate prayer. Buying a decaying, boarded-up dollar home in Gary, Indiana, seemed like madness. She never expected the rotting floorboards to conceal a $1 million secret that would change everything. Carly Martin stared blankly at the polished mahogany desk, the rhythmic drumming of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Chicago skyscraper mocking the sudden, shattering collapse of her entire life. At 32, Armand, she had dedicated 7 grueling years to Patel and Caldwell Estates, a premier commercial real estate firm. She had sacrificed weekends, holidays, and her own personal life to climb the corporate ladder, believing that loyalty and relentless hard work would eventually secure her future. Instead, it had painted a target on her back. Across the desk sat Royal Patel, the firm's CEO. His tailored Italian suit and impossibly calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the sheer financial violence he was currently inflicting upon her. 3 days prior, federal auditors had flagged a massive discrepancy in one of the firm's offshore escrow accounts, a deficit of nearly $400,000. Royal, a man who possessed a legendary reputation for ruthless self-preservation, needed a scapegoat. Carly, who had blindly signed off on a stack of routine ledger transfers at Royal's direct behest the previous month, was the perfect candidate. "It is a tragedy, Carly. Truly it is," Royal said, his voice dripping with rehearsed corporate sympathy. "But the paper trail is undeniable. The board demands accountability. You are terminated, effective immediately. Consider it an act of profound grace that we are not pressing criminal charges." Carly opened her mouth to argue, to scream that he had given her those documents, that she had trusted him, but the cold, predatory glint in his eyes silenced her. He had insulated himself perfectly. If she fought him, she would be buried in legal fees she could not afford, fighting a billionaire in a court system that heavily favored the wealthy. 15 minutes later, a heavy-handed security guard escorted her through the opulent lobby and out into the torrential autumn rain. She held a small cardboard box containing a framed photograph of her late mother, a dying potted succulent, and a handful of pens. The nightmare, however, was only just beginning. Shivering and drenched, Carly took the L train back to her modest apartment in Lincoln Park. She had drained her savings account entirely over the past 2 years to pay for her mother's terminal cancer treatments, falling 2 months behind on her exorbitant rent. She had promised her property manager, a notoriously unforgiving woman named Brenda Walsh, that her upcoming quarterly bonus would cover the arrears in full. When Carly arrived at her door, her key would not turn. The metallic click of a changed lock echoed loudly in the quiet hallway. Taped to the door was a bright orange eviction notice. Brenda had not waited. Knowing Carly was technically in breach of contract, the management company had expedited the lockout procedure. Sitting on the cold corridor floor, Carly pulled out her phone and checked her banking app. After an automatic payment for her phone bill had cleared that morning, her available balance was exactly $22.14. She had no job, no home, no family to lean on, and a reputation that Royal Patel would undoubtedly ensure was radioactive in the Chicago real estate market. For 2 agonizing nights, Carly slept in a 2 4-hour public library on the South Side, hiding her exhaustion behind stacks of reference books to avoid being kicked out by the librarians. It was there, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights and the glow of a public computer terminal, that desperation forced her hand. She was scrolling endlessly through government assistance websites when a bizarre local news headline caught her eye. Rust Belt Revival, City of Gary Auctions, Abandoned Homes for $1. Carly clicked the link. The municipal government of Gary, Indiana, a city grappling with decades of industrial decline and urban decay, had launched a radical revitalization initiative. To combat the blight of abandoned properties, the city was selling seized, dilapidated homes for a single dollar. The catch was steep. The buyer had to demonstrate the ability to rehabilitate the property and bring it up to municipal code within 12 months, or the city would reclaim it. Normally, an applicant had to prove they had a minimum income to qualify. However, buried in the fine print of the program's charter was a loophole designed for emergency housing relief. If an applicant agreed to take on properties classified as Category 4 severe blight homes, deemed structurally hazardous, and slated for imminent demolition, The income requirement was waived. All it took was $1, a signature, and a willingness to step into a disaster zone. Carly had nothing left to lose. She spent her last few dollars on a bus ticket across the state line to Indiana. At the Gary Municipal Courthouse, a weary city clerk named Thomas Abernathy looked at Carly with a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Miss Martin, I need you to understand what you're signing," Thomas warned, sliding a thick stack of liability waivers across the counter. "The property at 412 Sycamore Drive has been abandoned since the late 90s. It's suffered water damage, vandalism, and God knows what else. The city assumes no responsibility for injuries sustained on the premises. Are you absolutely certain?" Carly placed a crisp, wrinkled $1 bill on top of the waivers. "I'm certain, Thomas. Give me the keys." Thomas sighed, stamped the paperwork, and handed her a heavy, rusted brass key. "Good luck, Miss Martin. You're going to need it." The rain had finally stopped by the time Carly dragged her wet suitcase up the cracked, weed-choked sidewalk of Sycamore Drive. The neighborhood was a ghost town of America's industrial past. Once proud mid-century homes sat rotting behind overgrown oaks, their windows boarded up with plywood, their porches sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. Number 412 was the worst of them all. It was a two-story Victorian-style build that looked as though it had been chewed up and spat out by time itself. The gray paint had violently peeled away, leaving the wood underneath exposed and graying like a corpse. The roof was missing several shingles, and the front porch leaned precariously to the left. The front yard was a jungle of thorny briars and tall, dead grass. Carly stood on the sidewalk, the reality of her decision crashing down upon her. It wasn't just a fixer-upper, it was a hazard. But as the brisk Indiana wind cut through her thin coat, she knew it was the only roof she had. She climbed the creaking porch steps, praying the wood would hold her weight, and slid the rusted brass key into the front door. It took 3 hard shoves with her shoulder to break the seal of swollen wood and grime. The door flew open, plunging her into a thick, suffocating darkness. The smell hit her instantly, a pungent mix of mildew, rotting wood, and damp earth. Sunlight struggled to pierce through the gaps in the plywood-boarded windows, casting eerie, slanted beams across the front parlor. The floor was covered in a thick layer of debris, shattered glass, ancient newspapers, and torn, water-damaged wallpaper that hung from the walls like dead skin. "Home, sweet home," Carly whispered, her voice trembling slightly in the cavernous, silent space. Her first week was an exercise in pure survival. Without electricity or running water, Carly relied on a battery-powered lantern and filled gallon jugs from a public park water fountain half a mile away. She bought a cheap sleeping bag from a thrift store with the change she had scrounged from the bottom of her purse, making her bed in the center of the living room where the ceiling didn't appear to be actively leaking. Her days were spent performing grueling, back-breaking labor. She ripped up ruined carpets, hauled bags of trash to the curb, and scrubbed walls until her knuckles bled. She survived on cheap peanut butter and crackers, driven entirely by adrenaline and the sheer terror of failing. If she lost this house, she truly had nowhere else to go. By the second week, Carly moved her efforts to the kitchen. It was located at the rear of the house, a dark, miserable room where the linoleum flooring had curled up at the edges, warped by years of standing water. Carly had noticed a pronounced dip in the floorboards near the old, rusted cast-iron stove. Fearing structural rot that could collapse the entire floor, she borrowed a heavy steel crowbar from a friendly neighbor 2 streets over, an elderly man named George, who had taken pity on the crazy city girl. Kneeling on the dirty floor, Carly jammed the crowbar under the thick layers of peeling linoleum and heaved. The old flooring tore away with a sickening rip, revealing the original hardwood beneath. But as she cleared away the debris, she froze. The wood here wasn't rotted. It was completely solid, but it was cut differently than the rest of the room. A perfect 3-by-3-foot square was outlined in the floorboards. Carly brushed away decades of grime with her gloved hands, her heart beginning to race. At the edge of the square, perfectly flush with the wood, was a heavy, oxidized iron ring. It was a trapdoor. Carly frowned. The city blueprints Thomas Abernathy had given her explicitly stated that 412 Sycamore Drive was built on a standard shallow crawlspace. There was no mention of a basement, let alone a hidden cellar door concealed beneath layers of linoleum. She gripped the iron ring and pulled. It wouldn't budge. It felt as though it was bolted from the other side, or simply fused shut by time and rust. She stood up, grabbed her crowbar, and wedged the forked end into the narrow seam between the trapdoor and the floor. Taking a deep breath, Carly threw her entire body weight against the steel bar. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud, agonizing groan of protesting wood and snapping rusted hinges, the trapdoor popped open. A rush of stale, frigid air blew upward, carrying with it a bizarre, metallic scent that smelled faintly of old paper and engine oil. Carly grabbed her battery-powered lantern and shone the beam down into the gaping black hole. Instead of the muddy dirt of a crawlspace, the light revealed a narrow, steep staircase made of solid concrete, descending deep into the earth. It went down much further than a standard basement, at least 15 feet. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Rational thought told her to stop, to call the city, to seal the door back up. But curiosity, fueled by the sheer desperation of her circumstances, propelled her forward. Carly slowly descended the concrete steps, the air growing colder and damper with every cautious movement. At the bottom of the stairs, her boots touched a solid, poured concrete floor. She swept the lantern beam across the darkness, her breath catching in her throat. She was standing in a massive subterranean room that spanned the entire footprint of the house above. But it wasn't an ordinary basement. The walls were lined with thick, reinforced brick, and heavy wooden beams supported the ceiling. In the center of the room sat a long, heavy oak table covered in a thick layer of undisturbed grime. But it was what lined the far wall that made Carly drop her crowbar in shock. Stacked from floor to ceiling were wooden crates, stamped with faded 1920s-era manufacturing logos. And nestled between them, bolted directly into the reinforced brick wall, was a massive, antique bank vault door. It was an astonishing piece of machinery, constructed of solid steel, with a heavy brass combination dial that caught the weak light of her lantern. Carly slowly approached the vault, her mind racing. Why would an ordinary, dilapidated house in a Rust Belt city have a military-grade bank vault hidden 20 feet underground? She reached out and wiped the grime away from a brass plaque riveted above the vault's dial. The engraved letters were still legible. Property of Anthony Powell, Carly gasped. Even with her limited knowledge of regional history, the name Anthony Powell rang a massive bell. During her days in high-end Chicago real estate, she had occasionally dealt with historical properties. Powell had been one of the most notorious and elusive bootleggers and underground financiers of the Prohibition era. He was a phantom who had allegedly laundered millions of dollars through shell companies and secret banks across the Midwest, before vanishing completely in 1931, taking his illicit fortune with him. Rumors had always suggested he had a network of safe houses hidden outside of Chicago, securely stashed away from Al Capone's territory. Carly stared at the heavy steel wheel of the vault. Her hands shook violently. She was standing inside Anthony Powell's lost sanctuary. And if the heavy locked vault door was any indication, the phantom banker hadn't emptied it before he disappeared. Carly placed her hand on the cold steel of the vault. The desperation that had choked her for weeks suddenly transformed into a sharp, electrifying thrill. She had been fired, discarded, and left to rot by men in glass towers who thought they held all the power. Now, buried in the dark, she was about to take her power back. Sleep became an absolute impossibility. Carly spent the next 48 hours in a manic state of hyperfocus, practically living in the freezing subterranean bunker beneath 412 Sycamore Drive. The heavy steel vault loomed in the shadows like a sleeping giant, entirely impervious to the rusted crowbar she had used to pry open the trapdoor. Carly knew that calling a professional safecracker was out of the question. She had no money to pay them, and more importantly, revealing a Prohibition-era bank vault to a stranger would immediately invite the local authorities, the IRS, and the city government to lay claim to whatever was inside. The property was technically hers, but the legal battles over historical treasure could tie up the assets for decades. She needed to open it herself. Leaving the vault for a moment, she turned her attention to the dozens of wooden crates stacked against the reinforced brick walls. Prying the lid off the nearest crate, she expected to find old machinery parts or rotting textiles. Instead, The lantern light reflected off pristine, dark glass. The crate was packed with straw, protecting neatly arranged rows of sealed liquor bottles. Carly carefully lifted one out, wiping the dust from the label. It was a bottle of smuggled Scottish single malt whiskey, dated 1923. She opened 3 more crates, finding them entirely filled with Prohibition-era bourbon, French cognac, and rare champagne. Even without knowing the exact market value, Carly's background in managing estates for wealthy clients told her that untouched, century-old liquor was incredibly sought after by private collectors. Just the contents of these crates could easily be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the real prize lay behind the heavy brass dial of the vault. Behind the barricade of crates, Carly discovered a small, forgotten alcove set into the brickwork. It contained a heavy mahogany desk, remarkably preserved in the dry, stale air of the bunker. The desk drawers were locked, but a few heavy strikes with her crowbar splintered the old wood, allowing her to pull them open. Inside the bottom drawer lay a loaded, rusted revolver, a box of tarnished ammunition, and a thick, leather-bound ledger. Carly carried the ledger back to the center of the room, sitting on an overturned crate as she opened the brittle pages. The handwriting was elegant, written in sharp, black fountain pen ink. It was the personal diary and accounting book of Anthony Powell. For hours, Carly read through the meticulous records of an underground empire. Powell had documented every bribe paid to Chicago police captains, every shipment of illegal liquor across the Canadian border, and every dollar laundered through legitimate real estate holdings. But as she reached the final entries, dated October 1931, the tone of the ledger shifted from calculating business to paranoid desperation. Powell knew the federal government was closing in, but the feds weren't his primary concern. He was being hunted by his own business partner, a man who intended to hand Powell over to Al Capone's enforcers and seize the laundered real estate empire for himself. Carly's breath hitched in her throat as she read the name of the traitorous partner, underlined twice in angry, jagged ink. Elias Patel. Her mind reeled. Elias Patel was the legendary founding patriarch of Patel and Caldwell Estates. He was Royal Patel's great-grandfather. The prestigious, billionaire-backed commercial real estate firm that had just fired her, ruined her reputation, and thrown her onto the street was originally built entirely on stolen bootlegger money. The final entry in the ledger was a vow of vengeance. Powell wrote that he had sealed his most liquid assets and the true founding documents of Elias's crimes inside the vault, ensuring that even if he were murdered, Elias would never get the money. At the very bottom of the page, scrawled in the margins, was a simple sequence of numbers, 34 to 12, minus 88 to 04. Carly dropped the ledger and rushed to the vault. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip the cold brass dial. She spun the wheel to the right, stopping on 34. Click. She spun it left to 12. Click. Right to 88. Click. Left to 04. The silence in the bunker was deafening. Carly grabbed the heavy steel lever beside the dial and pulled downward with all her remaining strength. Deep within the door, a massive series of interlocking steel bolts disengaged with a heavy, metallic thud. The vacuum seal broke with a sharp hiss of stale air, and the massive door swung outward on its perfectly balanced hinges. Carly raised her lantern and stepped into the vault. The room was smaller than the bunker, lined entirely with steel. In the center sat a single metal table stacked high, with neatly bound stacks of paper. But it was the back wall that made Carly's knees give out. Stacked in gleaming, heavy rows were bars of solid gold bullion. Beside them sat dozens of safety deposit boxes containing velvet bags heavy with antique, diamond-encrusted jewelry. She moved to the table, picking up one of the paper stacks. They were Series 1,928 gold certificates in denominations of $1,000, uncirculated and perfectly preserved. To a bank, they were worth their face value. To a currency collector, they were worth exponentially more. But the true weapon lay in a manila folder, resting in the center of the table. Carly opened it to find original, signed contracts, property deeds, and a written confession from a corrupt judge detailing exactly how Elias Patel had framed Anthony Powell for murder, stolen his clean assets, and founded Patel and Caldwell Estates. Carly looked at the fortune surrounding her, then down at the folder that held the power to completely destroy the legacy of the man who had ruined her. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her dirt-smudged face. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to take everything. Armed with a fortune in prohibition gold and a weaponized century-old secret, Carly knew she had to tread carefully. Walking into a bank with gold bullion would trigger immediate federal flags. She needed an expert, someone brilliant, ruthless, and entirely outside of Royal Patel's sphere of influence. Using her dead cell phone, which she charged at the local public library, she reached out to Jonathan Croft. Jonathan was a high-end historical acquisitions attorney based in New York. Carly had crossed paths with him years ago during a complex commercial zoning dispute. He was known for his eccentric methods and his deep-seated disdain for corporate bullies. Carly used one of the gold certificates as a retainer, sending a secure photo of it to Jonathan's encrypted email with a simple message. "I have a vault. I need a ghost." 48 hours later, Jonathan stood in the freezing bunker beneath Sycamore Drive, adjusting his designer glasses as he stared at the stacks of gold and crates of whiskey. For a man who rarely showed emotion, he looked entirely, utterly, completely speechless. "Carly," Jonathan whispered, picking up a bottle of 1,923 Macallan. "The gold alone is worth roughly $18 million at current market weight. The certificates and the jewelry push it to 25. This whiskey, this belongs in a museum or in the private cellar of a Saudi prince. You are sitting on a dynasty." "I don't care about the whiskey right now, Jonathan," Carly said, leaning against the vault door. She handed him the manila folder. "I care about this." Jonathan read through the fragile documents, his legal mind quickly calculating the implications. He looked up, a predatory grin forming on his face. This is the smoking gun of the century. The Patel Empire was built on fraud, theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. While the statute of limitations for the crimes has long passed, the civil implications, the SEC violations regarding their foundational assets, and the sheer public relations nightmare, it would obliterate their stock price overnight. Royal Patel would be ousted by his board in an instant. "Good," Carly said coldly. "Set up the meeting." Over the next 3 weeks, Jonathan worked his magic. He established a blind trust in the Cayman Islands to legally and quietly liquidate the gold and jewelry through private, high-end auctions in Europe, ensuring the funds were thoroughly washed and taxed appropriately, so Carly was untouchable. With millions now sitting securely in her accounts, Carly was ready for the final move. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Royal Patel sat at his polished mahogany desk, nursing a glass of scotch. His firm's stock had been dipping recently, and a mysterious private holding company had just aggressively purchased a massive block of his firm's outstanding debt. He was stressed, awaiting a meeting with the anonymous CEO of this new holding company to negotiate terms. The heavy oak doors of his office swung open. Royal stood up, plastering on his rehearsed corporate smile, ready to greet his new rival. His smile instantly evaporated. Carly Martin walked into the room. She was no longer the desperate, soaked, and terrified woman he had fired a month ago. She wore a tailored, slate-gray Tom Ford suit, a pair of expensive Italian leather heels, and an expression of absolute, terrifying calm. Jonathan Croft walked in right behind her, carrying a sleek, titanium briefcase. "Carly?" Royal stammered, his composure shattering. "What is the meaning of this? Security!" "I wouldn't call security, Royal," Carly said smoothly, taking a seat in the plush leather chair opposite his desk, the exact chair she had been fired in. "Unless you want them present when I hand over the original 1,931 documents proving your great-grandfather was a murdering bootlegger who built this firm with stolen money." Royal froze, his hand hovering over his intercom button. "You're insane. You have nothing." Jonathan stepped forward, opened the briefcase, and placed high-resolution, authenticated copies of Anthony Powell's ledger, the deeds, and the confessions onto the mahogany desk. Royal's eyes darted across the documents. As he read his great-grandfather's signature on the confession, all the blood drained from his face. He sank slowly into his chair, suddenly looking like a very old, very small man. You flagged an escrow account to cover up your own embezzlement and pinned it on me, Royal, Carly said, her voice like ice. You stole my career. You threw me onto the street. You thought I was disposable. What do you want? Royal whispered, his voice trembling. Money? I can write you a check right now. Just name your price. I don't need your money, Carly replied, leaning forward. I have my own. Here is what is going to happen. Tomorrow morning, you are going to issue a public statement resigning as CEO of Patel and Caldwell Estates, citing health reasons. You are going to sign over your voting shares to the board. And before you leave this building today, you are going to wire the $400,000 you stole back into the offshore escrow account, accompanied by a signed confession completely exonerating me. If I resign, I lose everything, Royal choked out. If you don't resign, Jonathan interjected cheerfully, tapping the documents, we release this to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the SEC by noon. You won't just lose the firm, Royal. The board will sue you into absolute poverty for burying historical liabilities, and the federal auditors will reopen every file you've touched in the last 10 years. Royal looked at Carly, searching for any trace of mercy. He found none. The predatory glint that he usually wielded against others was now staring right back at him, refined and sharpened. With a shaking hand, Royal reached for his gold fountain pen. 2 days later, the business world was rocked by the sudden, immediate resignation of Royal Patel. A quiet press release buried in the financial pages noted that a former employee, Carly Martin, had been fully exonerated of any financial discrepancies due to an internal auditing error. Carly watched the news on a brand-new flat-screen television. She wasn't in a Chicago penthouse, however. She was sitting in the living room of 412 Sycamore Drive. The house was completely unrecognizable. A massive crew of local contractors had spent the last month gutting the property, restoring the original Victorian architecture, installing state-of-the-art plumbing and electricity, and bringing the home back to its former glory. The neighborhood was buzzing with activity. Carly hadn't just stopped at her own house. Using her newly acquired multi-million-dollar fortune, she had quietly purchased 20 other abandoned dollar homes on Sycamore Drive. She hired local Gary residents to rebuild them, paying them excellent wages, transforming the blighted, forgotten street into a thriving, beautiful community. As Carly walked out onto her newly painted wraparound porch, breathing in the crisp Indiana air, she smiled. She had taken the worst moment of her life and turned it into an empire. She had defeated the monsters in the glass towers, not by playing their game, but by rewriting the rules entirely from the ground up. She looked down at the heavy brass key in her hand, the key that had cost her $1. It was the best investment she had ever made. If Carly's incredible journey from rock bottom to uncovering a forgotten fortune left you speechless, hit that like button and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that hitting rock bottom is just the beginning. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never